Hello, good morning everyone. So, I guess we're going to start discussing yesterday's problems since you have solved pretty much everything. We will mostly stop on the problem D, and sad news about problem I. I just this morning I could not solve this problem by myself, so probably there's a bug in the test, probably, or even in the other solutions. So I will fix this. I'm very sorry if this happened. Probably spent some time maybe trying to solve the correct solutions. So I'll fix this, and after that we'll rejudge everyone's solution. So again, I'm sorry so it happened, and we'll fix this. And maybe if you just want to make sure that your idea was right, we can just talk a little bit about this problem. So you had one specific vertex that has to have a fixed degree after we take the subset of all the edges, and it may appear that if you construct the minimal spanning tree like manually, when you do usually, it may appear that this vertex could have larger than this fixed camber K degree or lesser. So in this case, the main idea for the solution was to add some constant for all edges adjacent to the first vertex, and if we add some positive number, if this degree is still less than K, or otherwise if it's still larger than K, then we have to add some more constant, and otherwise if the degree is too small, we should subtract some positive constant from the edges. And to find the appropriate constant, we use the binary search, and after we looking for this constant with the binary search, then we're running like a cross-class algorithm. So again, I think that other solutions had a bug in there, but I'm pretty sure, maybe probably as you are, that I've got the correct solution. So I'll fix this, and after that we will solve this problem. And let's have just a brief talk about the problems you have solved. So it's problem A, when you had to power some number to some power of look like this. You know, like binary powering is working, so it just takes usually a logarithm of this number of iterations to find actually the value by some modular. I've seen that someone was using the approach to reduce the modular, so you could just make this power smaller, so take it modular phi, right? And this was one of the solutions, but there was a easier one, so you do not have to power every numbers from 1 to n, but you can do it only for primes. And if some number is not prime, so it can be split it into two divisors, so you can just calculate this power that causes f. Right, so that's all you should do to calculate this function for every number, and this optimization was already enough. little bit, a few words about problem E, about the game. So a lot of teams have solved it, and I think it's just possible to just guess solution, right? But it's also not very hard to prove it. So the answer for this game, so every outcome of the game is just maximum leaf, right? Or this was minimum, maximum. I think maximum. And so why the answer is always a maximum leaf? For the first player, he can just end the game by cutting this edge and leaving on this maximum leaf, right? But what if he would not do so? This would mean that he will try to get the better outcome of the game. So let's consider this maximum value has x, maximum leaf. And let's suppose that the first player tries to get larger than x outcome. Since we know, since this game is finite, the answer always exists, and it's like some certain number that both players should know if they are very, if they can try all different outcomes, right? So the answer is always should be known for two players who can play positive, who can play optimally. And if the first player tries to get a better outcome, then the second player on his hand could always prevent him from getting better than X outcome. Because after the first player makes some move, so he cuts the tree into the two parts and one part is left, we know for sure that at least one leaf from the original tree would be the leaf after the cut. So the second player can always find those leaves from the original tree and finish the game with just this leaf. And since the value of this leaf is x or smaller, this is how the second player could prevent the first one getting the better than x outcome. So the answer is just take the maximum leaf, the first step. Let's say a little bit of problem G. So it had her a strange function that finds the second number which is not divisor of the argument. Right, or 500. And we have to sum this value of these functions for all numbers from 1 to n. And to solve problems like this, there is a common approach that if you want to make some functions, you can always iterate over the argument, right? But you can also iterate by the result, and after that you will sum the number of arguments that provides this result. Right? So for this one, if we could just iterate over the answer, so if we can fix the second divisor, if we could count how many integers have a resulting value to this number, then we could just count and sum for all of them. And first, we can notice that actually the value of this function is always not very large. So there's always like no greater than 100, or the restrictions in the statement, and we can always iterate, and it's very easy to prove that this number is not very large. Otherwise, if it would be greater than 100, it would mean that this number is divisible by almost every number from 1 to 100. And since you know that LCM of these numbers may be divided by some on the number which is the first not divisor, would always be greater than. Yeah, so you can for sure know that the value of the function is not greater than 100. And actually, to simplify calculations, we could not just try all second not divisors, but we can also iterate over the pairs of the first and the second, and count how many arguments, so that the first is the first not divisor, the second is not the second not divisor. So after we iterate, then the problem becomes pretty easy, just combinatorical stuff. So we have 1, 2, 3 first, second. So how we can calculate how many positive integers from 1 to n are divisible by everything in between. So it's divisible for everything except these two numbers. So it should be divisible by the LCM of everything what's here, right? And if this LCM is already larger than n, we know that there is a zero such numbers. But if it is not larger than n, we will have some LCM and some first and second. So LCM should be a divisor. First should not be divisor, and second should not be divisor. So just combinatorical problem. First, we need to check that LCM is not divisible by the first and the second, and after that, I think it will have everything will have a period of LCM, and actually to count how many numbers that satisfies the restrictions, we just LCM first and second. So just using an exclusion formula to count how many not exactly like this. Here, LCM. this period, and we'll have to apply this period. And we will just apply it and divide it by LCM. Yeah, just like this. So again, this problem was solved pretty much about everything, so I don't think we have to talk really much about it. So I guess we will just leave the rest of the problem, since it was solved almost about everything. If you could not solve it and you still want to have an answer, you can ask either your friends or me, and we will discuss it more. But today I would like to stop on the problem D and discuss it a bit more details. So here we had a function like this. And we had to promote the order of the pairs A and B to achieve the smallest result of such formula. First, let's say that this expression is not very meaningful. We can just replace it with some cost, some matrix. Right? It's just the cost that if we pick the index G for some index I. So this is the first hint that it was not actually any specific magic in the XOR operation. It's just some function of two indices. And after that, we can just imagine that if for some index I we're picking the index J, so we can just draw an arrow from J to I. And so if we would not have this restriction, so the J could be any index, so we will just pick the best for everyone, and that will be for sure the global optimal. But since we know that this these pairs should be ordered, it clearly becomes impossible if your arrows would construct a cycle. Right? If it happens like this in your global construction, that we cannot achieve for sure this result. But if there would not be a cycle, so if it will look like this, so there is no cycle. We know for sure that there exists a topological sort of this graph if we drew it after we find the minimums for everyone. And we can always find the order so that our edges or arrows goes from the left to the right. We know it for sure if there is no cycle. So let's consider not only the arrows or edges that we are picking to our global answer, or just attempting to get a global by picking the local optimals for everyone. Let's just draw everything. And I forgot to say, let's say that if some g equals to I, or if we picking just it itself, so let's not write it like, not like this, but let's write like we are drawing the arrow from some root vertex. So every vertex should have an one arrow pointing to it, one incoming arrow, and it has could have multiple outcoming arrows, and you can also put an arrow from some root vertex which is not required to have any incoming arrows. So we can draw a picture like this. We have a complete graph. So for each pair of vertices, we know what would be the cost of drawing an arrow or picking the one index like this ij. We know what would be the cost if we pick this vertex j for vertex I in this formula. And what we are looking for? We are looking for subset of these edges so that each vertex has at least one incoming edge, at least one, or like for this formula it clears it. It should have only one, so we're going to pay only for one. And yes, and there should be no cycles, right? Because there is a cycle, we cannot arrange our vertices so that this index j will always be before the I. So since there should not be edges and so there should not be cycles, and every vertex should have one incoming edge, we know that there should be at least n edges, and from this we get that we should you have at least one outcoming edge from our root. It's also obvious. And since there would be no edges, so cycles, so if we had a cycle, only then it could be possible that this cycle is not reachable from the root if we have at least n edges. Otherwise, each vertex will be reachable from the root. And I said there should be no cycles. So the problem is just to pick a subset of edges of minimum cost so that every vertex is reachable from the root. So it's very similar to very common MST problem, minimum spanning tree problem, but this time we have directed edges and we have one fixed vertex for which we do not have to build any incoming edges, and we require that every other vertex should be reachable from the root. So this problem is also known, and there is an algorithm, or even several algorithms that would solve this problem. So we can discuss the algorithm itself. First observation is very common and easy to understand that if we are, let me just draw some picture. So this tree is just a cyclic graph where everything is reachable from one vertex. Yes, looks like this. And for every vertex, it's obvious that there is no point of leaving more than one incoming edge. So if we had a picture like this, yeah, so it is not a tree, no, in any sense. And it is also not possible that we would have this answer if we are looking for the cheapest, for the subset of the minimum cost, because we can just erase edge, any edge at the vertex that has multiple incoming edges. So we can just erase any of them. And if the weights are positive or non-negative, it would be always a better solution. So since in this problem we also have non-negative weights, it works for us. So we can understand that if there are several incoming edges to the one vertex, we will leave exactly one of them. Yes. The next step, that if we, for some vertex we have several incoming edges, A, B, C, yeah, so we can do the trick. We can find the minimum among them, and after that we will subtract it from every edge and just put it to the answer. And I forgot to say, let's first learn how to find the weight itself of the resulting subset, not the subset itself. Okay, so first we're looking only for the total weight. So if, again, we have several multiple edges, we can find the minimum of them, and we know that we will for sure have to pay this value to the answer, and if we just subtracting the constant from all edges, the structure of the answer will never change, right? So we can do it. We're subtracting the weight from the edges. We're remembering that we have subtracted it, and since we know that there will be always one incoming edge to this vertex, we can just remember how many we have subtracted from this weight, from this edge in total. We will do it several times. We can just remember how many times the total number we have subtracted from this edge. And since for every vertex we will have exactly one incoming edge, we will just add all of these cumulative subtractions to the answer. So we'll compensate all the subtractions and we'll still keep the total answer correct. But what is the point of doing this? After we have subtracted the minimum, we know that at least one of the weights will become zero. because where the minimum is achieved after subtraction, we will have 0 weight on this edge. And after these modifications in our graph, there will be several edges of 0 weight, and for each vertex there will be at least one such edge. And if it appears that the edges, these free edges, they are forming a tree, already tree with a root, we know that this is the answer because we have taken the smallest edge for every vertex, and after that we'll have just free tree. So its cost is already 0, and we know that it's already the best optimal result. But if it not achieved, then we know that there are cycles in. So there would be a cycles constructed from the edges of free cost. Yeah. So here is some trick, or maybe a little bit hard thing to understand. If we have several edges of the free cost, we can just say that we take all of them to our subset, right? Even that some of them will be redundant, since is the cycle. It's for sure in our final subset there would be no cycles. But since these edges are free, why would not we just pick all of them and put to the current answer? So if in our graph we would have several cycles, we are only now considering the cycles of the 0 cost. So at this step we do not care about all the edges that left with the positive cost. We only consider the 0 edges, only 3 edges. And we are saying that we are going to pick all of them, since we will not have to pick all of them in the end. But for now, since they are making some cycles and preventing us from the analyzing, from getting the tree, we will just pick all of them. And what does it mean? If we have some cycle and we are going to pick all the edges on this cycle, we know that the reachability for all vertices inside this cycle, we do not care anymore. So there always would be a path between any pair of vertices after we picked this cycle. And it works not only for cycles, but in general it works for the strongly connected components. And in this problem we also can have several incoming edges by the 0 cost, right? It's also possible if there would be several edges with the equal minimum cost. So we can also have a picture like this. And again, since it is not really a cycle, but since it is a strongly connected component, again, we know that for every pair of the vertices inside this component, further we do not care anymore about reachability between these pairs. So what we are going to do is to compress all strongly connected components into the one vertex. Are you familiar with this procedure?
Yes.
So this means that if we have some strong components and some edges between them, here it's no, doesn't matter either edge is a zero cost or if it's a positive cost. After we compress all the strongly connected components into the sum vertices, we'll just keep all the edges between the components, but then they will go between the compressed components. And since here if we have several edges between the pair of the vertices, we'll just keep the cheapest, right? Since we're looking for the minimum subset. So after we have compressed our graph, we just doing again from this step. Again, we will look for the minimum incoming edges for every vertex. And now we're subtracting, again remembering how many we have subtracted to compensate the total answer. And again, there would appear some cycles. Once there is no cycle, we found the answer. So we have left with the tree of the zero cost, and we'll just end our algorithm. Otherwise, we again compressing the strongly connected components and moving to the next step where we'll just make some more subtractions and accumulate the total cost of the answer. And this is how the algorithm works. And this algorithm, remember, only provides you with the total weight. It will not be still clear what the subset itself we've taken, because when we are picking these cycles or strongly connected components of zero cost, we find that we are picking all of them. But if we pick all of them, the cost would be much higher, because if we subtracted from the all edges some constant for everyone, we could only do this if we know for sure that in the end we will use only one this edge. But this appears that in the current answer, when we're compressing the component, we're saying that we're using all of these edges. It can be that we have used more than one incoming edge for some vertex. And if we again will look what edges we ever used in this compression, we will have that for some vertex it appears that we used several incoming edges. And since we have subtracted from all of them, maybe at different times, but we could subtract from the several edges, and we have put this compensation to the answer only once. We will have not matching the cost actual and of the subset if we'll just uncompress everything we have compressed during the algorithm. So we only can calculate the total weight of the optimal subset. And for this problem, it was kind of enough, since in this problem we are not asked to find the value of this function itself, but the permutation of the pairs. And it also says that if there are several, we should output the graphically smallest, right? So when you face this restriction, it's a problem that you have output lexicographically smallest something, you know that you're going to construct it just one by one, picking the smallest prefix greedy. So we are trying to get this permutation. First, we're trying to put 1 into the first position, right? And we wanted to check, is it possible to achieve the optimal result if it would be the 1 in the first position? And what this means, that 1 in the first position, if we have just some fixed prefix, we know that we only will have edges from this prefix to all other unfixed vertices. Yes, and we do not, and we will not have any incoming edges for this prefix. Yes, so we just erase this edges. We're saying that like we can always we will just calculate what would be the current result for this prefix. Let's say this prefix is already connected from the root, and we just solve this problem again with this fixed thing that kind of means that this prefix in the permutation is already fixed. And by running this algorithm again from the beginning, we'll just find the optimal weight if we arrange the rest of the elements in the best way. And if we've got the same weight as in the optimal solution, so we just keep in this one in our prefix, and again trying here to put 2. If it is not matching the total weight after we calculate, we'll just pick another 3, check again, run the algorithm from the beginning. And what about symptotics of this algorithm? We know that after we make this iteration, it would be at least 1 component compressed of the size more than 1. So we will we will at least decrease the size of our graph of vertices by 1. So it will be 1 n iterations, and to check all the edges and to find some connected components, it will be number of like e, but since we have here we have a complete graph, this will be works in cubic function from the number of vertices. And to find the optimal permutation, again we will have to find we'll have to fix the n positions, and for every position we could try n options. So this algorithm asymptotics is 5 degree, and for this algorithm this estimation is very rough, because it appears that it would be always more than 1 strongly connected component. So, and since in this problem it's not even the graph given itself by this function, would provide us with almost random weights. So the algorithm works very quickly for these data sets. So that's all about the algorithm used in this problem. And there is algorithms that are faster, and which is also provides us the way how we can reconstruct this, etc. So with it a little bit harder, you can just read about about them. If you want, I can show you. I could send you the link to the materials. Does anyone have a question? Since we are going to have a break. Okay, since we are going to break anyway, you can just come later to me and ask a question if you wish. Okay, 10 or 15 minutes break. since we already started talking about minimal spanning tree problem from the problem D, now let us talk a little bit about the more common variation of this problem. So we just have to pick some subset of edges in the bidirectional graph, so the whole graph remains connected. So let's consider the variation of the sparse graph, where the number of edges is about the same as the number of vertices. So just number of vertices multiplied by some graph. So what would be the optimal algorithm to solve this problem? So if for example we had a complete graph, so no prims algorithm works well for it in this case, and in the case, so remind you, it works exactly in this square vertices. And in the case of the sparse graph, now these are classical algorithms, right? Which works in E. Yeah, you know both of the algorithms, right? But is the Kruskal's algorithm is asymptotically optimal for in case of the sparse graph? Does anyone know any better approach that has a smaller asymptotics than this? Yeah, Ruska. And so you're familiar with this one. So probably will not be very interested because it's what I was going to talk next. And yeah, that's right. We can use the Brook algorithm to improve the complexity. And what about the algorithm itself? The algorithm works in the following way. So that we have several vertices, and we state that for any vertex, if we consider all edges, from this adjacent to this vertex, and we pick the edge with the smallest weight, we can always use this weight, use this edge to build a minimal spanning tree, including this edge. And we can do for all this, for all the vertices. And why is it so? We can easily prove this if for some this vertex we've used we are not using the cheapest edge adjacent to this vertex u, so we're not using this. And we will construct the answer of tree without this edge. So these two edges, these two vertices would be connected in our answer, but without using this edge. We can always add this edge, and on the appearance cycle we will remove the edge of the or just not the edge, like any another edge. On this cycle we'll just remove this edge. So also adjacent to this vertex, and which is on the cycle. So in this way we would improve the result if this weight is the minimal weight is it cheaper, or we'll just keep it the same if this weight h has the same weight. But in algorithm, let's say that we will pick the h by the minimal weight, and if there are several has the same weight, so we will just pick the one with the smallest number of the neighbor. So in this way we can always define the exactly one minimum h, and when we will find the smallest weight at h for every vertex. For example, for this we'll pick this one, or this will pick this one, or this will pick this one, we pick this one, and it always will end with the cycle of size 2. There will not be any larger cycles, because it's not possible that this h is the minimum. For this one, this h is even smaller weight, this even smaller, and it appears that this h has a smaller weight than the first one, but we picked this h as the first step. So it could not always will not be the case where the cycle will have the length smaller than 2. And naturally, I will have this like a tree itself, which would end with a small cycle in the root. And after we do so, after we find the smallest h for every vertex, we can say that we can add all of the edges to the current answer, and it will still be possible to construct the minimum spanning tree using all of the edges. And what does the algorithm do? It finds the smallest edges for everyone, and that just adds all of them to the answer. And when we have added some edges, we can again compress our graph, so we can just create some large vertices, and we'll keep only edges between several components of this components which is created by the minimum edges. And with this single iteration, we will have that the number of vertices in our graph will decrease at least in 2 times. Because every vertex would have, like, if we have some component, right, so if it has more than 2 vertices, it will compress into the one vertex. So in the worst case, we'll have every component of the size 2, and exactly in this case, we'll have the number of vertices will decrease in 2 times. So this algorithm works as following until we'll have the exactly one vertex in our graph. So let's calculate the asymptotics. Since we have proven that for each step the number of vertices reduces in 2 times, we will have only log b iterations, and for every iteration we will have E, which is just for looking for the smallest H for every vertex. So as you see, we already got a better asymptotics than Pascal's algorithm, right? But I think it also can be proven even more. For example, if we will not do the only Barufka's algorithm, but what if we could make several steps of Barufka's algorithm, and after that we will finish with another one. So let's consider we have used Barufka's algorithm k times. Yes. So for this k iterations of Barufka's algorithm, we spend k multiplied by e time to run Barufka. And after that, if we proceed, for example, with Pascal's algorithm, we would have the b divided by 2 power k vertices, and sadly we could not have less than e edges here, so maybe we would probably want to use Prim algorithm, but let's calculate for the cross calls as well. So what would be the complexity for the Pascal's algorithm here? It just log e, yet not very interesting. So instead of the Pascal's algorithm, let's use the Prim algorithm, which works only related to the number of vertices, which is good for us, and so we decrease this number by the Barufka. So if we finish the process by the Prime's algorithm, we will have v divided by 2 power k squared. And
Alan, could you please write down the name of the algorithm, the proof? Thank you.
I guess it's spelled like this, I'm not sure. So, in this way, we'll have this asymptotics if we apply the Barufka's algorithms k times, and after that we'll finish with the Prim's algorithm. And how can we understand if there is such a number k which provides us the asymptotically better solution in the end? So now we have to pick some k to achieve better than this. Is it possible or not? Is it with a k equal to log v, or is there some better choice? I think if we are looking for the minimum of this function, we have to derivate this equation, right, and find the root of the derivative. So this was v square is power 2k. function from K, and we want to find its derivative. It will be something like E minus E squared 2 over K. This doesn't matter in the asymptotical. And so we need to solve the equation equals to E divided by square of 2. Yes, so I think I'll leave it like this. By solving this equation, we can find the best option for the K, which would there's no point to solve this because it still would not be clear that the function, the total asymptotics is even greater or smaller for this function because it's hard to compare. But using this approach, we can solve these equations and we got the optimal parameter for the K, which minimizes the overall asymptotical time for this function, and which means that using combination of the Borukkas algorithm and the Primus algorithm, we can achieve even asymptotically. It's of course it's only asymptotically, so there's no practical point of using this combination. We can just implement only one of the algorithms. But if you're just curious about the theory, so you can try and understand that this approach has a better estimation. Yeah. And yeah, that's what I would like to tell about the Borukkas algorithm. And since we have the case where someone, for example, is familiar with Borukkas algorithm, I think we have to clarify what topics would be interested for you. So maybe, for example, if I prepared some subjects and most of you, or even the half of you, are already familiar with these topics, we can skip it and probably find something more interesting. And of course, you can also suggest some topics. I think by solving the contest, you will have some problems, or even, for example, like yesterday's contest, I saw that you had the troubles with problem D, so today we have covered some theory about it. But if you, for example, have requirements for some specific theory, maybe there is some very rare which you want me to help you to get familiar with, it's also possible, and you can suggest me topics. So, for example, for today's, I would like to talk about taught you the set problems, but maybe you are familiar with this one, so I'm not sure how interesting it will be for you. So, is everyone familiar with set problem and particularly to set problem? Do you know how to solve it? No?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, Andrew did comment briefly about it.
He didn't talk about it. Yeah, let me check. So I think we should I will just have to prepare the list of the topics and show everything to you, and maybe we can provide some voting for the topics. I don't know how can we understand what topics would be more interesting.
Andrew did send us a Google Forms where we could, with a list of topics, and we could answer how much we knew about each topic.
Oh,
Maybe you can ask him to give you the results of the...
Let's change it. He did that privately to me.
Adam, if I recall correctly, I think Andrew asked us whether we knew about a Hungarian algorithm, and not many people raised their hand. I'm not sure. So that's a suggestion.
Okay, thank you. And are you familiar at all with flow algorithms?
Yes.
And for particular Hungarian algorithm about the destination problem, do you know? Let me remind you. So the problem which states it for the Hungarian algorithm, we have a bipartite graph, and it's complete. So for each pair of vertices, we know the weight that it goes to match one of the vertices from the first part with the second vertex in the second part. And our goal is to find the perfect match with the smallest total cost. Right. So, in other words, we wanted to find the permutation. So, for each vertex in the first part, to pick exactly one vertex for the second part, and for every second part, for each vertex, there should be exactly one corresponding vertex in the first part. So, the Hungarian algorithms provides us a solution for this problem in n-cube asymptotics. And are you familiar? I will not cover the Hungarian algorithms itself right now, but I can show you how you can solve this problem in these asymptotics without Hungarian algorithm. Do you know how to do it? Using just the flow algorithm. Okay. So it is naturally that for the problems like this, when you have to use some matching problem by flow, you just create some additional vertices, right? And for these edges, you build the edges with the capacity 1 and the weight, it's actual weight, and for this, capacity 1 and the weight is 0. Are you even familiar with the flow algorithm that uses the costs of the edges? Yes? Yeah, so it's pretty much all for this problem. we just have to find maximum flows and minimum costs in this network, and since this net does not have edges of or cycles of the negative cost. Initially there is no negative cost in the cycles, so we can just use the Dijkstra algorithm tool for looking for the smallest path from this vertex to this one, and only thing that we have to apply is to use Johnson's modification to the Dijkstra. So if you're not familiar with this, we just store in some potential for the vertices in the net, and for particularly this set, it could be just initialized with zeros, but if there could be negative cycles in the graph, we should use the Bellman's Ford algorithm. So that's about Johnson's modification. First step, we're using Bellman-Ford algorithm to find the smallest distance for every vertex, using only edges with a positive capacity, and we are initializing the potentials with the smallest distance from the S. Oh, not the. I made a mistake. We can initialize this if we have we don't have the edges with a negative cost, but since we don't have the negative cost here, if in our weights are positive, right? If the weights are positive, we can just leave the potentials equal to zero, and if there are some negative weights, we should run the Bellman-Ford algorithm and initialize the weights by the distance, and that's all. And after that, when we are using just a simple Dijkstra algorithm with just modifications that for each edge we calculating the cost differently, so using the potentials. So it's just original cost plus the potential of the vertex we are going from minus the potential of the vertex we are going to. So we're doing this modification to the weights of our edges using the current potentials, and just running the regular Dijkstra algorithm. And after that, after we found the shortest path, we are doing backtracking the same way how we're doing in the whole this kind of the flow algorithms. So after we pushing our new path to the current flow, we have to when we're looking for the edge that we are, one is adding, one is removing, we have to recalculate the weight already without the potentials, just taking the original cost to understand what was the actual cost of these edges. And after that, the final step in this iteration is when we ran the Dijkstra and found the shortest path to all vertices by this modified weights of the edges. To recalculate the potentials for all vertices, we just have to add the current distance to them. Sorry, I do not remember all the proofs about this algorithm, so what I can provide right now is just the algorithm itself, and we can calculate the asymptotics for it. So whenever we want to use the Bellman forte at the end, it will be just n v cube, right? But for positive we don't have to do it, and that does not influence on the asymptotics as a whole. And for many iterations we are going to do it's just v, because after in each iteration we are increasing the value of the cost by 1, and since the total cost, the total size of the flow should be exactly n, so we'll have v or n iterations. And what about the Dijkstra algorithm? So here we do not use any priority queue, any optimization to the Dijkstra. We're just using the simple Dijkstra which works in this b square time. So just very simple Dijkstra. And since v is just 2n, so this asymptotically works with the n cube as well. So it is has the same asymptotics as the Hungarian algorithm, but yes, this algorithm has a little bit larger constant, so it's a little bit slower than the Hungarian one. And if you still want to listen about the Hungarian algorithm, I should to remember a little bit about it, and maybe for sure I'll need to prepare a little bit to have a more entertaining lecture about it. But just for solving this problem, the destination problem, I in my experience, every time this algorithm with the flow works when the Hungarian algorithm is required. So for me, I implemented the Hungarian algorithm only maybe several times on the contest, but every time I'm using this approach, and this works good for me as well. And what to think about this approach is that you can just so easily to add some additional restrictions, or maybe increase and add some more layers, is just more flexible. So that's why I like it much more than the Hungarian one. So, any questions left about this part? So I guess that's all for today. I'll look into all topics. I'll contact Andrew and hope for the next time we'll pick the most suitable topics. And thanks for all questions about the Hungarian gate. We'll also consider looking into this. Yeah, and what about problem I from yesterday? I'm gonna fix it, and I hope today's evening you will see the results and you could solve the problem. Okay, any questions for me right now?
I've seen in some flow problems there's like this restriction in which you need like to maintain the same number. Like some problems that you're given some matrix and you need to like stuff and rows and columns and you have to keep like the same number of items in rows and columns, something like that. Like how can you model that kind of restrictions in flow?
I'd say that every restriction you should process individually. So some restrictions are even not possible to maintain with this flow model, but some restrictions can be solved very easily. So it's very individual by the type of restriction. But for example, a very easy restriction is that if for like our destination problem, for each row you can pick maybe one or two, so you can satisfy several columns with the one row. So it just means that for this row, for the layer of the row, you will just have here not the one capacity, but the number how many times you can use it. Like this. But it's very, very specific for this flow things, but very small change to the requirements can make from the problem which is solvable by this flow model to unsolvable. So it's, or even be hard problem. So it's very tight moment. So no like a common approach for every requirement. You can just look into some examples. Or for example, if we can easily add the lower bounds here, for example, if we, for each row we know how many columns we can satisfy with it, and for example we have the minimum amount of times we have to use it. So it is also a known thing. If we for some edge have its low capacity and its high capacity, it just also a very known flow problem. It still can be solved like this. Just for every edge, maybe you already know this, I don't know, which has a low and a high restrictions in the capacity. So you just you make a modification to the graph. You keep only high minus low on the edge. Actually, how many you can adjust the flow, and the rest L, which is you want to flow to make the flow for sure. You just put just to the output, and here put the input here, and you also make at your as just new, and from your old start and the end we create just one edge of the infinite capacity. And what you are doing is you're finding now flow from this new start to this new finish. That's how you just basically the common feature, how you maintain the edges with a low restriction. And for example, yes, you can just also apply this feature on this our set where we have the weights. Yeah, but again, the Hungarian algorithms works with a little bit better constant, and actually the Hungarian algorithm can be considered as a part of the simplex algorithm, which is used in more wider way in the linear programming. It is, how many of you are familiar with the simplex algorithm? It is used very rarely and in programming competition almost never, but it allows to compute some NP-hard problems in relatively smaller timings, and the Hungarian algorithm can be considered as just a corner case of the simplex algorithm for some problem where it works actually for polynomial time. So maybe the Hungarian algorithm could also be interesting, but as a part of the larger theory like linear programming. So we'll also consider this for the next lectures. Okay, any more questions?
Is it possible to adapt this algorithm to find the maximum weight matching instead of the minimum weight perfect matching? I think you
Maximum.
you can do
Is it
it.
still should be a perfect matching?
No. I think you can do it with invariance, right? It was used on a problem from the first week.
Again, you want to just in the destination problem, or can you just repeat the problem?
Instead of finding the minimum weight perfect matching, you'd like to find the maximum weight matching, not necessarily perfect.
It's just very so you want to find just maximum weight, right? So okay, let's first thing to should say the problem from the minimum matching to maximum matching. You can just switch the sign of the weights. So if you were looking for the minimum matching, now you want to find the maximum matching, let's just reverse the cost. Yes, and if we are not looking for the perfect matching, just for some matching, if you consider this algorithm, which finds the maximum flow. So instead of maximum flow, we just remove this constriction for the flow to be maximum. We just want to find any flow of the maximum cost, and it is easy to prove that when we are following the iterations of the algorithm, we just find the first pass. If it's the negative, then we just keep it. Then we find the second one, and it's for sure would be larger than the previous one. You can just prove it. It works for every net. And so you just will stop once you have the increase in your chain with the path of the positive weight. You just stop at this point. So you only keep all the paths that improve your total cost. and that's all. So instead of doing the n iterations, you're doing iterations while the total cost is growing, and that's all. So yeah, it's also very easy to add the restriction to this model. Basically, you can just iterate what would be the total flow. Like try put here the 1, try what would be the maximum flow, try here 2. So you iterate over the actual value of the flow and find the best cost for it. But it is not necessary to do everything from the beginning. You just do one pass and the second one, and it just would be the same thing. Yes, that was a good question. So I guess that's all. See you on the contest.